Inalienable rights and the human lifetime. As I've mentioned in earlier videos, rights are requirements for survival. After a man has died, survival is no longer an issue. My father-in-law survived 50 missions over Germany during World War II as a bombardier. There's a marker with his name on it under those trees behind me. This place is maintained by living people. Rights apply only to the living. It may one day become possible to preserve the body of someone who has died and later revive him and restart his brain functions. A person in that condition would then be similar to a tree that goes dormant in winter, or a goldfish stuck in the ice of a frozen pond, and we would have to recognize that he was still alive. But for now, this remains an idea for science fiction. So let's work our way back through a man's lifetime and see how far we get. Now, before we go any further, I want to make it clear that I don't subscribe to any of the politically correct nonsense of using he, she, him, her, his, hers, and so on. Anyone who's taken an English class knows that the word man refers to human beings, mankind, without regard to gender or any other personal distinction. Think of sharks and tigers. They are man-eaters. They eat humans indiscriminately. So let's start with an adult such as myself. Obviously, rights apply to me. How about a teenager? This was me at about age 19. It's true that he can get away without doing all the thinking necessary for his survival. His parents do a lot of that for him. In many cases, all he needs to do is follow along blindly. But the point is, someone has to do the thinking. If the teenager is not going to do it, someone else must do it for him. Just like an adult, the teenager has no alternative means of survival. Regardless of how much or how little reasoning he exercises, he still has no alternative, and the principle of rights applies to him. Let's consider a young child who doesn't have the mental development to make decisions for himself. He can decide, but his decisions are almost certain to be disastrous. If he is going to survive, he's going to need a lot of help. Just like the teenager, he's still a human being, and regardless of how much or how little reasoning he exercises, he still has no alternative, and the principle of rights applies to him. Here's a phrase I like to use. Humans don't have rights because they can think. Humans have rights because they must think. One's capacity for reason doesn't alter this basic fact. Now let's back it up all the way to birth. What is the earliest moment at which the requirement for the freedom to act on one's judgment begins? Not the ability, the requirement. During gestation, a fetus does not depend upon the exercise of reason. Its future is determined by the mother, who makes the life and death decisions for it. It is an appendage of its mother. The unborn possess no rights. What alternative means of survival is there? Well, an umbilical cord connected to a reliable source of oxygen and nutrients. I must have lost my original one, so I'll demonstrate with this piece of rope instead. Pretend I'm in the womb. The requirement for freedom begins at the moment of separation, at the moment when the life-sustaining connection to its mother is lost. This is the moment when a potential man becomes an actual man. This is when rights begin. This moment usually occurs soon after birth, when oxygen is entering the baby's bloodstream through its lungs
instead of through the umbilical cord by way of the mother's bloodstream and the placenta. At this point, the doctor or father or birth attendant will often sever the cord for convenience, and it's safe to do so at this point. We could theoretically identify the split second, the exact instant that the cord ceases to function, by considering what would happen if the cord were pinched and the flow of oxygen and nutrients were interrupted. This can happen with a cord prolapse. If the cord is pinched too soon, the fetus will die. Thus, a new man, a new individual, a new separate human being enters the world at the instant all means of survival other than reason are no longer available. Several ramifications immediately arise from this. First, we must recognize that rights are an integrated unit. If you have the right to life, you have all the rights that are included in it. Any concept such as partial inalienable rights or semi-inalienable rights doesn't hold up. Give yourself plenty of time to think about this. So, if everyone has the same rights from the moment of birth onward, how do we prevent children from harming themselves or harming others? Well, no one has the right to harm others, so we physically stop them. That's easy. Children, stop fighting. Do I have to come in there? How do we prevent them from harming themselves or destroying our property? Primarily through property ownership. You play nicely with that, or I'm going to take it away. Not that either. It doesn't belong to you. There is much more to consider about the custodial relationship. More on that in a future video. But to review, man does not have rights because he can think, or because some men can think. Man has rights because all men must think. In other words, one's capacity to exercise reason, or one's degree of skill, or the amount of independence one has achieved through successful reasoning, does not and cannot alter the rights that one possesses. Rights arise out of a lack of any other means of survival. I can't resist addressing this one. We often hear parents teach their children to respect property, but I think this message is too brief. What we really are teaching them is that the owner of the property is happy to share his delicate items, but we want the children to respect his desire to treat those items of property with care. Controlling the actions of another because you own the property they are using applies equally to a friend or relative who is in a hospital recovering from an accident, or someone who is comatose, or brain damaged, or even retarded. In other words, anyone who requires the care of another. You are providing bandages, food, clothing, a safe and comfortable place to live, and these things all require time and effort to provide. Next, stating that a man has inalienable rights beginning at birth has obvious implications for the abortion issue. I'll have much more to say on that issue in future videos, but for now I'll just say that rights can never be taken away. They can only be violated, and they are violated by the initiation of physical force. Now, murder is probably the most extreme violation of inalienable rights. So from the moment of birth, it is possible for a man to be murdered, but not prior to that moment. A fetus can be destroyed prior to the time when inalienable rights apply, and I certainly find it unpleasant to think about that, but it cannot be called murder. Barring some unusual variations, a woman who decides that an abortion is her best course of action is within her rights to do it at any time prior to delivery. To prevent her would require initiating force against her, and thus violating her rights. The essential messages that I hope you got from this video are, first, that, as I emphasize frequently, rights do not originate from any particular man's abilities or capacity or degree of success at using reason, but instead they originate from man's requirement to use reason. Thus, all men have the same rights all their lives. Secondly, inalienable rights are a unit. You can't add any or take away any. If you have the right to life, you have all of the rights subsumed under that. This means that all men have the same rights from the moment of birth to the moment of death. As I indicated, there are many more perplexing, perhaps mind-boggling situations that can arise, such as test tube babies, conjoined twins, the murder of a pregnant woman. In future videos, I'll describe how the principle of inalienable rights applies to all of these cases.